Good morning, Year 10s, and welcome to your English lesson. Okay, so our goal is over this 2 weeks of lessons, 9 lessons, is to finish A Christmas Carol, because we honestly were not expecting a lockdown, and we need to make sure that we have finished this text, that you all know this story. Now, with that in mind, that does mean that we are going to have to start from part way through chapter 3, because that's where Mr. Ponsford's class was. Now that means that some classes are going to be repeating parts that they've already completed, and I want to make this very clear. That is not an excuse for you to say, I'm not going to do this lesson, I'm not going to engage with this work. In fact, you should want to engage with it, because it's really important for you, when it comes to these exams, when it comes to these texts, that you know them really, really well. So actually, recapping and repeating information that you've already done is only going to benefit you. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just going to help cement what you've learned in your mind. Now, I might be creating Google Forms to go with these lessons. At this point, I'm not entirely sure. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the quiz questions and ask you to do them on paper. If there is a Google form to go along with it and it's in the description of the YouTube video, then pause and go complete it there. Either way, as long as you're doing quiz, it does not matter. So, my quizzes are always 2 knowledge recalls, 2 definitions, 2 best synonyms, 2 techniques and meanings, 2 word classes. Most of them are multiple choice. You need to make a guess for every single question. It doesn't matter if you get it wrong, but you do need to be putting something down. So number 1 is describe Ebenezer Scrooge at the start of the novella. Bonus point for a quote. Number 2 is describe Marley's ghost. Same thing, bonus point for a quote. Number 3, I want you to define the word lover. If I say someone is your lover, what does that mean? Number 4, I want you to define the word straight, the adjective straight. So if I was to say that line you've just drawn is really straight, what does that mean? Number 5, this is our best synonyms. So one word is highlighted in red and is bold, and you need to decide which word is the best synonym for that one. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. What is the best synonym for the word shrewdly? Is it A, cunningly, B, astutely, or C, intelligently? Number 6. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. What is the best synonym for frosty? Is it A, chilly, B, icy, or C, Baltic? Which is the best synonym there for frosty? Number 7, this is our technique and meaning. So this first one is not multiple choice. I have asked you a question, so make sure you get a guess down. If we look at this line from Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet during his Queen Mab speech, he says, "Oh, a lawyer's fingers who straight on dream of fees." What is the significance of each dream to the type of person named? So in the Queen Mab speech, he names lots of different people. He names ladies, he names lawyers, he names courtiers. What is the significance of each of their dreams? So think about the dreams. Here we've got lawyers and their fingers who straight dream on fees. So they dream about fees, the money they can make. What is the significance there? Number 8, Mercutio also says, "Oh, a lady's lips who straight on kisses dream." What technique can we see in this quote? Is it A, metaphor, B, alliteration, or C, simile? Number 9 and 10, these are our word classes. So the word in red and bold is the word that I want you to tell me what kind of word is it. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. The word thaw, is it A, an adjective, a describing word, B, a noun, a naming word, or C, a verb, a doing word? Number 10, no warmth could warm him, no wintry weather chill him. Again, what's the word class of the word warmth? Is it A, a noun, B, an adjective, or C, an adverb? Please pause the video to make sure you have answers to all of these questions. We will go through them shortly. Okay, so answers. So, Ebenezer Scrooge is the main character in A Christmas Carol. I've said he's a miserly old man. I've put a quote of hard and sharp as flint. You might have used solitary as an oyster. You might have used the fact that the cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly. That whole question 5, question 6, question 9 and question 10, those quotes are all from A Christmas Carol, and they are all about Scrooge. So if you've used any of them, you can give yourself a bonus point. If you're not certain if your quote has come from the book and if your quote is about Scrooge, you can double check by using the online text version of the text, which you can find simply by Googling A Christmas Carol full text online. The very first link is a link to something called Project Gutenberg, which has the full text for you. Number 2, describing Marley's ghost. So Scrooge's dead business partner who warns him of the coming of the ghosts is his description. I've said dead as a doornail. Arguably might not necessarily be about Marley's ghost. It does just talk about Marley being dead as a doornail. But you could also talk about the fact that it had its livid colour made it horrible. So this word horrible is how it's described. You could also talk about the hair looking like it's stirring. Anything like that. Again, you can check for yourself using Project Gutenberg. Lover is a partner in a sexual or romantic relationship outside marriage. You are not dictionaries, so you might not have this word for word. However, make sure that you've got something similar before you give yourself that mark. Number 4, straight, the adjective. I've said extending or moving uniformly in one direction only without a curve or bend. So when I said the sentence of, if I was to say that line you've drawn is very straight, that's what we're talking about. You may have also talked about straight being an adjective around sexual orientation. That's also fine. Number 5, shrewdly, the best synonym is cunningly. Number 6, frosty, the best synonym is icy. Mercutio, the significance of the dreams is that in their dreams they appear to get exactly what they want. So lawyers want money, ladies want kisses, courtiers want to curtsy in a good way. The kind of everything that their heart would desire essentially is what they get in the Queen Mab speech. Number 8, a lady's lips who straight on kisses dream. Lady's lips, a little bit of alliteration in there. Number 9, thaw. The word thaw means to kind of like defrost or to kind of warm, and that is a verb. And number 10, the word warmth is a noun. Make sure you've got these kind of ticked and crossed and you've marked yourself out of 10. Your title for today is Scrooge and Christmas Present. So remember, as I said, we are going from about halfway through the novella, partway through chapter 3, and we're going to go through it to the end over these next 9 lessons. That does not mean if you've already read chapter 3 or already read chapter 4 that this is not applicable to you. You are still expected to be completing these lessons regardless of if you have done them before or not. So, we're going to finish reading Christmas Carols chapter 3, or Stave 3. So this is Stave 3 part 2. Now, Mr. Ponsford said that his classes had got to around the Cratchit family, so I've gone from just after the ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge away from the Cratchits. So, the ghost of Christmas Present is this jolly, happy kind of giant of a character who takes Scrooge around to see how different people celebrate Christmas on Christmas Day. And Scrooge we're starting to see some change in him. He already kind of began maybe a little bit to change with the Ghost of Christmas Past, but you could argue that his decision to kind of put the light from Christmas Past out shows that he wasn't willing to change. And with Christmas Present, we really start to see Scrooge heading in that direction of changing, particularly when he sees Tiny Tim and he kind of worries about Tiny Tim and Tiny Tim surviving. So, I've got the text on the screen so you can kind of follow along as I read it. You might want to go away and you might find that it's more useful for you to go and read it for yourself. That is also fine. As I said, you can find the whole text of A Christmas Carol online by Googling Christmas Carol full text online, and the very first link is to Project Gutenberg A Christmas Carol, and it's all there in full. So, by this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness and the roaring fires in kitchens, parlours and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbour's house where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches. Well, they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on every one within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, 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 yet was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me, see!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly then advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his figure sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and pressing on above the moor, sped. Whither? Not to sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm-birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men, who watched the light and made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder 2, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke, below his breath, to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss whose depths were secret as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much great surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha, ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha, ha, ha!" If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and they assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha, ha, 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 ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women that never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised look, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was. all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he is very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereabout Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there, in good temper, year after year, and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for there was a musical family, and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in a bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness, with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game of blind man's bluff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains wherever she went. There went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavouring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain upon her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with the large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined the forfeits and loved her love to admiration when all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessing quite right too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in the head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this the spirit said could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in menagerie, and was never killed in the market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!" "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man." "Whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew, "he wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it, nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!" Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time, but the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time that passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in the open place, he noticed that his hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at the moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here!" From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh man, look here! Look! Look! Look down here!" exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shrivelled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both in all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that which written is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it!" cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your fractious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. Okay, Year 10s, so that is the end of Stave 3, or Chapter 3 of A Christmas Carol. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to go kind of back over what we've just read, but looking at particular quotes, looking at particular things. So the first thing that I want you to think about, and I want you to kind of answer this question, is why did Dickens include these places? So the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to see a miner and their family in a kind of very small kind of mud hut on a moor, so like a kind of swampy place. It's very barren, very miserable, very desolate. And yet he takes him to see these miners, and these miners are singing and they're enjoying Christmas songs. Then he takes him to a lighthouse, and in the lighthouse there are 2 kind of old men who kind of like are kind of very old, and their hands are all calloused and dry and everything, and they kind of embrace Christmas and enjoy Christmas. And finally we have the ship at sea, literally in the middle of nowhere, and these people are also enjoying Christmas. So Dickens chooses to include these 3 settings, or these 3 places, when he takes Scrooge around Christmas Present, basically to say that even in the most isolated, desolate, horrible places, even in these places, people still recognise Christmas in a way that Scrooge currently has been unable to do. Scrooge, who has enough wealth to live quite a comfortable life, does not recognise Christmas in the same way that these very poor people, these very isolated people, these lonely people who are away from their families, are still able to engage with and to enjoy Christmas in a way that Scrooge can't. Now, it's also important to think about poverty as relative. Now, my class, we've spoken about this quite a bit, and I know Miss Burkett's class has, and I'm sure everyone else has spoken about it. But if you think about being poor and thinking about people in poverty, we have Scrooge, who has a lot of money, but if you think about comparing Scrooge and his nephew Fred, you would maybe say that Fred is poor, because he is poorer than Scrooge. If we think about comparing Scrooge and Bob Cratchit, Bob Cratchit is extremely poor, like he is in poverty, he lives in poverty, he gets paid very, very little. Now, if we take the miners, the lighthouse workers and the ship people, these people would be even poorer than Bob Cratchit and his family. So if we had like a scale of poor, we've got Scrooge at one end, which is, not poor at all, and then at this far other end we've got these 3 groups of people. So it's also thinking about how poverty relates. So we've got this idea of these settings which are isolated and desolate, and we've also got this idea of people who are poor, and despite that they're still able to enjoy Christmas and recognise Christmas. So I've kind of explained why Dickens chooses to include these places. I just want you to write a couple of sentences summarising why he included these places. So Dickens includes the miners, the lighthouse, and the ship at sea because, and a couple of minutes just to write a few sentences. Pause the video while you complete this task now. Okay, so this is how the rest of the lesson is going to work. Now, what I'll do is I'll give you a couple of quotes, and as you can see, I've picked particular words and I've asked you questions about them. So after the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to see those 3 isolated, desolate places, he takes him to Fred and his friends at Christmas. And I just want to ask you, why do you think he decided to include that? So if you could answer that question to start off with. And then I have these 3 quotes. Now, what I'd like you to do is essentially write them out and do quote explosions. So where I've highlighted a word or a phrase and I've asked you a question, I want you to do the same. And I'd like you to answer that question. So Scrooge was the ogre of the family. What is the word, class? And what is the meaning of the word ogre? Thinking about the technique here. So the mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party. What's the technique? Whose name as well? And then why? Why does it cast what does it mean? And here we have Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart. So again, what's the technique here? The literary technique. That he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given in time. So what does the fact that he wanted to thank, even when they give a toast to him, even when they've kind of described him as this kind of miserable, grunting bear of a person running around London, why does he still want to thank them? What does that maybe tell us about Scrooge? So pause the video, copy out these quotes, complete your quote explosions, answer my questions about why the Ghost of Christmas Present, why Dickens chose to include taking Scrooge to see Fred and his Christmas. So pause the video to complete this task now. Okay guys, so we're just going to run through this quickly with some of the things that me and my class thought of and that classes in the past have thought of. So he includes the family, he includes Fred and such because it's all about the fact that Christmas is meant to be about family, and it also shows Scrooge what he's missing out on. As Fred says, Fred invites him to Christmas every single year and Fred basically declines, and Fred kind of says, you know, he does this but the only person who really suffers is him. It doesn't do Fred any harm to invite him, and all he does is misses out on a dinner. So the only person who really suffers is Scrooge. Scrooge is the person who's missing out on things here. If we look at the word ogre, the word class, it's a noun, it's a naming word. It kind of means that he's an outcast or different. You could also talk about him being evil and monstrous. So Scrooge is this ogre, he's this kind of monster who's separate to the family. The mention of his name casts a dark shadow. The technique is a metaphor, and it kind of suggests that it's kind of dulling, and that Scrooge's name, the mention of Scrooge it's miserable. It just ruins the whole mood. It ruins the kind of fun and the enjoyment of the party. It kind of just ruins everything when they mention Scrooge. He's not a pleasant person to mention. So Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart. So gay obviously here meaning happy, and that he basically enjoyed, even though he wasn't really there, he enjoyed watching, and he wanted to stay longer. He joined in, even though they couldn't hear him. He joined in with kind of like making his guesses and playing the games. The technique for light of heart is a metaphor. It kind of tells us that he's becoming kind of more open, and he's letting his heart kind of open and be more free and happy. And the fact that he wanted to thank them tells us that he had fun. Even though he wasn't literally there, he enjoyed himself so much that he wanted to kind of thank them. And the fact that they kind of mocked him a little bit, he's not hurt by that, and he just is realising how much fun it would have been to be there because he wanted to stay longer. He asks the ghost to let him stay longer. So make sure if there's anything here that you missed, or if you had something similar but not exactly the same and you want to add little bits, feel free to do that now. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, and then after he leaves, the ghost takes him to see a lot of other places. Many different places. And Dickens doesn't go into detail about every single one of these places. Now, following that, we get introduced to ignorance and want. Now, ignorance and want are kind of embodiments or metaphorical embodiments of two things that were really problems in Victorian society: literally ignorance and want. Ignorance meaning kind of two things. Ignorance meaning lack of education. So if someone is uneducated or someone doesn't understand things, you might see them as ignorant. But also ignorance can be seen as the rich people who are educated simply ignoring or not recognizing the problems in their society, choosing to kind of like to ignore the problems of poverty that are happening in their society, being ignorant in that way. And also we have want. Now want is not like, you know, oh, I want this, like a spoilt toddler. Want is about things that people actually need. Really a better word for it would be need. But people in society, they need things. They need food, they need shelter, they need housing, they need all of these things. They need money for that. And it's this idea that there are so many people who are in want. They don't have what they need to survive and to thrive. So these are two kind of creatures, and it's important that they are children. Now the reason that it's important that they are children is because Dickens felt like the real victims of kind of industrialization in England, the real victims of it were children, particularly because children would be potentially forced to work, and in those kind of situations they would become potentially crippled and deformed through the machinery being quite dangerous. They would be bruised and beaten by the people in charge of those kind of workhouses. If they didn't work necessarily, they would go to if they are particularly poor, they might go to a ragged school. Lots of you will have heard about ragged schools, these schools where they're not really educated, but they're simply looked after and given a meal, and they'd go to those schools in rags, which is why it was called a ragged school. But you know, ragged schools aren't really doing their job because they're not fixing the problem. They're not educating these young people to a point where they can go out and get good work. So it kind of becomes a system. Poverty creates more poverty because these children are born into poverty. Their parents can't afford to send them to a good school or to look after them or to make sure they have the food and clothing and everything. So these young people don't get an education, which means they can't do kind of any better jobs because they can't maybe read and write, which then means that they become poor adults and they have children, and the cycle continues. So ignorance and want, really important that they're children, because that's a big part of what Dickens felt was wrong with society, was that children were the real victims, and ignorance being not only a lack of education or fair education in the country, but also the fact that people ignore this problem and they do nothing to kind of solve it or fix it. Now what I want you to do is, I've put on the screen a chunk of text where we are introduced to ignorance and want, and what I want you to do is I'd like you to write down all the quotes about ignorance and want that you think are really good from this section. So you can pause the video to do that now. Okay, so you should have written down all the quotes. What I'm going to do very quickly is I'm just going to show you, these are some of the quotes that I would maybe pick. The fact they're a boy and girl, coming back to they're a child, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, this dehumanization, they're almost like animals, prostrate, graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its finest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them, this idea that their faces should be youthful, they should be innocent, they should be angelic, and that they're the opposite of that. So if you're missing any of these quotes, or you think, oh, that is actually a really good quote, please make sure you jot it down and pause the video while you do that now. And then there's just a little bit more text here. Again, go through it, jot down your quotes about ignorance and want, pause the video. And these are the quotes I would have picked. So this boy is ignorance, this girl is want, beware them both. Most of all, beware this boy. So the boy is the worst because it's got that dual meaning. It's not just the ignorance of people who are uneducated and people who cannot access education. It's also the ignorance of people who choose to ignore the problems in society. And the ignorance of those people, it's the same as like fake news on social media these days. You know, people who don't really actually understand things sharing information like they know it. And you'd have seen the same in Dickensian times, you'd have seen the same in industrial Britain, where middle class and rich people would kind of say that poverty is inevitable. And we saw that with the economist Thomas Malthus, who says that poverty is inevitable. There will always be poverty. And actually, people spreading that kind of message that poverty is inevitable, that there will always be some people who have to be poor because there just isn't enough to go around. By spreading that message, you are almost encouraging that to happen. You're not trying to make a change. So when he talks about slander, those who tell it ye, those who tell you there is no problem, those who tell you that what we are doing to help the poor is enough, they are wrong. And if we don't change, then I see doom in our future. So as I said, make sure you've got these quotes down. And then really nice here at the end, the Spirit just turning on Scrooge and giving him his own words again. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? You are one of these people who thinks that there is a fix for this problem, and that what the system we have now is fixing this problem, and it's not, is the message that we are seeing here. So make sure you've got these quotes down as well, and pause the video to do that if you haven't already. Okay, Year 10, so that is the end of the lesson. I hope you've kind of, got all of those quotes and you've exploded them, and that this has been either informative or it's been a good, useful recap for you. As I said, it's really important you know this story really well, so actually recapping the information is super useful. Okay, well done for all your hard work.